Hands behind your back. Now. The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and final, slicing through the quiet hum of a first-class cabin cruising at 30,000 feet in expectation of departure. And for a moment, everything paused, like the entire plane had forgotten how to breathe, because the man they were speaking to didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised, and that stillness made it worse, made it heavier, made it impossible to ignore as eyes turned. Phones slowly lifted, and whispers began to crawl through the aisle like static, because something about this didn't feel routine, didn't feel procedural, it felt personal. And at the center of it all stood Darius Cole, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, no watch, no visible status, nothing that screamed power, nothing that fit their idea of who belonged in seat 2A. And yet he sat there like the seat had been built around him, like the space itself recognized him even if no one else did. And that was the problem, because recognition in this cabin wasn't about presence, it was about perception, and perception had already made its decision the moment he stepped on board, the moment eyes scanned him and found him lacking in whatever silent checklist they carried. And now here it was, the consequence of that judgment, dressed up as protocol, delivered as authority, enforced by a uniform and a tone that didn't ask, only commanded, and still, Darius didn't move, his hands resting calmly on the armrests, his gaze steady, not defiant, not submissive, just certain, like a man who had seen this moment before in 100 different forms and knew exactly how it ended. But before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius Cole, because the tension didn't break, it thickened, like the air itself had weight now, pressing down on every passenger. Watching this unfold, as a flight attendant, Nicole Harris stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, lips tight, her expression not uncertain but resolved, like she had already decided who Darius was and what needed to happen next. And beside her, Brian Foster, younger, sharper, carried that same energy, the kind that didn't question orders, because it believed in them. And somewhere behind them, a well-dressed couple, white, polished, smiling just enough to suggest inconvenience rather than concern, hovered near the aisle, their eyes flicking between Darius and the seat. That seat, 2A, first class, paid for, confirmed, scanned, and yet somehow no longer his, at least not in their version of reality. And that was the quiet part no one said out loud. That reality in spaces like this wasn't always about facts, it was about who people believe those facts belong to, and right now, belief wasn't on his side. Sir, we've asked you multiple times, Nicole said, her voice controlled but edged. You need to comply. And the word comply hung there, heavy, loaded, not just with instruction but with implication, because comply meant accept, it meant step aside, it meant agree with the version of events being written around you. And Darius finally moved, but not the way they expected, not standing, not resisting, just turning his head slightly, eyes meeting hers with a calm that felt almost out of place. Check the system, he said, his voice low, even, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening closely. But everyone was listening now, because silence had turned this moment into a stage, and every word carried. Nicole didn't blink, didn't reach for the tablet in her hand, didn't verify anything, because this wasn't about checking anymore. This was about control, about maintaining the narrative already set in motion. There is no record, Brian added quickly, stepping forward like reinforcement, like volume could replace certainty. You're not listed for this seat. And that was the second layer, the shift from doubt to declaration, from question to conclusion. And around them, passengers began to lean in, some whispering, some recording, some just watching with that uncomfortable curiosity people have when they sense something isn't right but aren't sure how far it will go. A woman across the aisle, mid-30s, blonde, phone already up, murmured, "This doesn't look right," to no one in particular, while a man 2 rows back shook his head slowly, like he'd seen this before, like this wasn't new, just repeated, repackaged, replayed. And through it all, Darius remained exactly where he was, grounded, composed, not raising his voice, not matching their energy, because he didn't need to. And that restraint, that refusal to escalate, only made the contrast sharper. Because the louder they got, the calmer he seemed, and that imbalance started to shift the room in ways they didn't expect. Because people notice that, they notice when someone under pressure doesn't crack, doesn't fold, doesn't react the way they've been conditioned to expect, and it makes them question everything else. Sir, last warning, Nicole said, her tone tightening, her patience thinning, because control slipping is never comfortable. And Darius exhaled slowly, not a sigh, not frustration, just a measured breath, like he was marking time. And then he reached into his pocket, not quickly, not dramatically, just deliberately, pulling out his phone, the movement small but significant, because it signaled a shift, not in volume, but in direction. Make the call, he said into the device, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it landed in that space between doubt and certainty. And for a split second, something flickered across Brian's face, something like hesitation, like recognition trying to surface, but it was too late for that now, because momentum had already built, and systems, real ones, not the ones spoken out loud, had already started to move, invisible to everyone in that cabin, but very real, very precise, very fast, and still, outwardly, nothing had changed yet. The seat was still contested, the authority still asserted, the narrative still leaning in one direction, but under that surface, under that carefully constructed assumption of control, something else had begun, something they couldn't see, couldn't stop, couldn't undo, and Darius knew it. You could see it in the way he sat back, not retreating, not surrendering, just settling, like a man who had just placed the final piece on a board no one else realized they were playing on. And as the cabin filled with the quiet tension of a moment about to break, one thing became clear. This was never just about a seat, and in the next few minutes, everyone on that plane was going to understand exactly why. The cabin did not return to normal after that call. It shifted, subtly at first, like something invisible had entered the space and begun rearranging it piece by piece. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that made people uneasy without knowing why. Because while Nicole still stood firm and Brian still held his posture, something underneath their certainty had started to crack, and it showed. In the smallest details, the way Nicole's fingers tightened around her tablet, the way Brian glanced down at the device, as if expecting something to appear that had not been there a second ago. And across the aisle the woman who had been recording did not lower her phone. She leaned in closer, whispering to the man beside her. He is not reacting like someone who is wrong. And that sentence carried, not because it was loud, but because it was true, and truth in a room built on assumption always lands heavier than volume. Darius remained seated, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, but his presence had grown, not physically, but in weight, like the room had recalibrated around him without permission, and that made everything else feel slightly off balance. Sir, I need you to stand up now, Nicole repeated. But there was a difference this time, not in the words, but in the delivery. A fraction less certainty, a fraction more urgency, as if she could feel something slipping but could not yet name it. And Darius looked at her again, calm, steady, not confrontational, just present. You already checked, he said quietly, and those 3 words landed harder than any argument, because they pointed to the gap between what was said and what was done, and for a brief moment, silence pressed in again, thicker than before. Brian stepped forward, trying to fill that space, trying to reassert control. There is nothing to check, he said, but even as he spoke, his tablet buzzed, a small sound, almost insignificant, but in that silence it echoed, and he glanced down, just a flick of the eyes, but enough for Nicole to notice, enough for the woman recording to zoom in slightly, enough for the man 2 rows back to lean forward, and Brian's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a tightening, a pause, like he had read something that did not fit the script. What is it? Nicole asked under her breath, low enough that it should not have carried. But, in a room this quiet, everything carried. Brian did not answer immediately, and that hesitation was louder than anything he could have said, because hesitation is where doubt lives, and doubt spreads faster than certainty ever could. Darius did not look at the tablet, did not ask, did not need to. He already knew the sequence, already knew the timing, because while they were focused on the seat, on the surface, on the visible conflict, Something else had been set in motion the moment he made that call, something structured, something documented, something that did not rely on perception, and now it was beginning to surface, line by line, system by system. It is probably a glitch, Brian finally muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But that word, glitch, did not reassure anyone. It raised more questions then. It answered, because glitches do not usually come with names, and whatever was on that screen clearly had one. Nicole reached for the tablet, her movement sharper now, controlled but urgent, and as she looked down, her expression shifted, not to fear, not yet, but to something closer to confusion, like the ground beneath her had changed shape without warning. "This does not make sense," she said. And that was the moment the cabin leaned in collectively, not physically, but emotionally, because confusion in authority is contagious. It breaks the illusion that everything is under control. And once that illusion cracks, people start to question everything. The couple near the aisle exchanged a glance, their earlier confidence softening into something more cautious, because even they could feel it now, the shift, the imbalance, the quiet unraveling of a narrative that had seemed so certain just minutes ago. And Darius watched it all without moving, without interrupting, without adding anything, because he did not need to. The system was speaking now, and systems do not argue. They present, they confirm, they log. And in that moment, the story that had been built around him began to collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. "Who are you?" Nicole asked finally, not loudly, not dramatically, but directly, and that question changed everything, because it was no longer about the seat, no longer about compliance. It was about identity, about recognition, about the gap between what they thought they knew and what they were now starting to realize they did not. And Darius held her gaze for a second, then two, then three, not rushing, not avoiding, just letting the question exist in the space between them. And then he answered, not with a title, not with a name, but with something far more precise, someone you should have checked before you decided. And that line settled into the cabin, like a weight, not explosive, not loud, but undeniable, because it reframed everything that had happened, not as a misunderstanding, not as a mistake, but as a choice. And choices carry consequences, even at 30,000 feet, even before a plane leaves the ground, even in a place where people believe control belongs to the uniform. Because control, real control, does not raise its voice, it does not rush, it waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it reveals itself all at once. And as the first notifications began to spread across devices that were not supposed to be connected to this moment, across systems that were not supposed to intersect with this cabin, across channels that operated far beyond the reach of any single crew member, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This was no longer a situation they could manage. It was a situation they had already lost, they just had not realized it yet. The first sign that everything had shifted did not come from the crew. It came from the cockpit, a quiet chime that was not meant for passengers, not meant for public moments like this. But it rang anyway, sharp and out of place, and Captain Daniel Pierce, who had been standing just behind the galley entrance watching the situation unfold with controlled authority, suddenly straightened as his own device vibrated in his hand, once, then again, then a third time, rapid, insistent, and his eyes dropped to the screen, expecting routine, expecting a minor update. But what he saw did not match anything routine, because the message was not about departure clearance, not about weather, not about gate coordination. It was flag priority, internal, executive level, and it carried a name that did not belong in this moment, but was now impossible to ignore. And for a split second, his expression broke. Not fully, not enough for everyone to see, but enough for Nicole to notice, enough for Brian to step back half an inch, enough for the tension to tilt in a new direction. "Captain," Nicole said, her voice lower now, more controlled, but underneath it there was something else, something uncertain, and Daniel did not answer immediately, because he was reading, rereading, processing the kind of information that does not arrive unless something has already escalated far beyond the visible scene. And across the aisle, the woman recording leaned closer, whispering, "Something just happened." And she was right. Something had happened, just not here, not physically, not in a way anyone could point to yet, but it had begun somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere that did not need to raise its voice to be heard, and Darius remained still, watching, not the devices, not the crew, but the shift itself. The way authority begins to fracture when it realizes it has been operating without full information, and he had seen that fracture before, years ago, in a conference room in Chicago, when a senior executive dismissed him before a deal, told him he did not look like leadership, told him he was not the image they were looking for, and Darius had not argued then either, had not raised his voice, had simply let the meeting continue until the numbers spoke louder than assumptions, until the same executive who doubted him was asking for terms, asking for access, asking for a second chance, and now, standing in a different room, at a different altitude, the pattern was repeating, just with different uniforms, different stakes, and a much shorter timeline. "We need to pause boarding," Daniel said finally, his voice no longer sharp, but measured, careful, like someone stepping onto uncertain ground, and that sentence landed harder than any accusation had, because it meant something had changed beyond their control, something that required time, review, reconsideration, and Nicole blinked, caught between the script she had been following and the new instruction that did not fit it. "Pause boarding," she repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it make sense, but it did not, because pausing boarding over one passenger only happens when that passenger is not just a passenger, and that realization was beginning to spread, quietly, steadily, through the cabin. The couple near the aisle shifted in their seats, their earlier confidence now replaced with a careful distance, as if they suddenly wanted no part in what was unfolding. Brian looked at his tablet again, scrolling, searching, trying to find something that aligned with what he thought he knew, but every update seemed to pull further away from that certainty. And then it happened. The name appeared again, not as an anomaly, not as a glitch, but as a confirmed entry, attached to layers of information that no one in that cabin had access to, layers that carried weight, influence, authority, and Brian's voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "Nicole, this is not a standard profile." And that was an understatement, the kind people use when they are trying to hold on to control while it slips through their hands. Nicole stepped closer, her eyes scanning the screen, and this time, there was no attempt to dismiss it, no quick explanation, no confident correction, just silence, heavy and undeniable, because the system was not just contradicting them, it was exposing them, line by line, decision by decision, and behind them, Daniel's device chimed again. A new message, shorter, sharper, unmistakable. "Do not proceed without executive clearance." And that was it. That was the moment the room fully shifted. Because executive clearance does not enter situations like this unless the situation itself has already reached a level far beyond procedure, far beyond policy, and suddenly, everything that had seemed so certain just minutes ago felt fragile, incomplete, wrong, and Darius finally moved, not to stand, not to leave, but to adjust slightly in his seat, a small motion, almost insignificant, but in that moment, it carried weight, because it showed he was not reacting, he was waiting, and waiting, in a moment like this, is power. "You might want to read that again," he said calmly, not to challenge, not to provoke, but to direct. And Nicole did, slowly, carefully, as if each word on that screen had the potential to change everything, because it did, and around them. The cabin was no longer just watching, it was understanding, piece by piece, that what they were witnessing was not a disruption, not a misunderstanding, but a reversal already in motion, a shift that had started the moment Darius made that call, and was now unfolding in real time. And as the weight of that realization settled into every corner of the cabin, one truth became impossible to ignore. This situation was never about removing a man from a seat. It was about what happens when the wrong man is told he does not belong, and the system he controls decides to answer back. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted again, deeper this time, like the cabin itself had realized it was no longer in control of what was happening inside it. And Captain Daniel Pierce stood there holding his device. A second longer than necessary, reading the same message again as if repetition might change its meaning, but it did not. It only made it heavier, because now it was no longer a possibility, it was instruction, and instructions at that level do not come with explanations, they come with consequences. "We are holding this flight," he said finally, and this time there was no edge, no performance, just clarity. And that clarity traveled faster than any raised voice ever could, because everyone understood what it meant. Delays cost money, disruptions cost more. But halting a flight before departure for an internal matter meant something far bigger was in motion, something that had already reached beyond the aircraft, beyond the crew, into the structure that supported all of it. And Nicole's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. The rigid certainty she had held just minutes ago loosening into something more cautious, more aware. "Captain, with respect, this is a single passenger issue," she said. But even as she said it, the words sounded outdated, like they belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. And Daniel looked at her, not with frustration, but with something closer to realization. "It is not," he replied. And that was the moment the last layer of illusion dropped. Because when authority acknowledges it is no longer in control, everyone else feels it instantly. Brian stepped back another half step, his tablet still in his hand, but no longer a tool of certainty. Now just a screen filled with information he did not fully understand. And across the aisle, the woman recording whispered again, "This just got bigger." And she was right. It had grown, expanded beyond the narrow frame of a seat dispute into something systemic, something structural, something that could not be contained within the walls of a cabin. Darius watched it all unfold with the same steady calm, his eyes moving from Nicole to Brian to Daniel, not tracking them as individuals, but observing the shift in power itself, the way it transfers, the way it reveals where it truly sits when pressure is applied. And he had spent years understanding that, building around that, positioning himself where it mattered, not where it was visible, but where it was effective. And now, that understanding was doing exactly what it was designed to do. "Sir," Daniel said, turning toward him. Now, his tone measured, respectful in a way it had not been before. "We need a moment to review this situation." And that was not a command. It was a request, subtle but unmistakable. And that distinction did not go unnoticed, not by the passengers, not by the crew, and definitely not by Darius, who nodded once, not as compliance, but as acknowledgement. Because this was no longer about whether he would stay in his seat. It was about what came next, and what came next was already unfolding. Unseen but undeniable, somewhere far beyond the aircraft. Because while the cabin processed what it could see, systems elsewhere were processing what they could not. Financial lines, operational protocols, executive alerts, all moving in parallel, all triggered by a single call made less than a minute ago. And now those systems were beginning to intersect, to communicate, to escalate, and the effects were starting to leak back into the physical space. Brian's tablet buzzed again, louder this time, and he did not try to hide his reaction. He looked at it, eyes widening just slightly, enough for Nicole to catch it, enough for her to reach over and see for herself. And this time, there was no confusion, no attempt to reinterpret, just recognition. "This is flagged at the highest level," she said quietly, almost to herself. But the words carried, and once again, the room leaned in. Because highest level does not leave room for doubt. It confirms it. And across the aisle, the couple who had been waiting for that seat shifted again. Their earlier entitlement now replaced with a careful distance. Like they suddenly understood they had been standing too close to something they did not fully grasp. And Daniel's device chimed again. A call this time, not a message. And he answered it immediately, stepping slightly aside but not far enough to escape the attention of the cabin. "Yes," he said, listening more than speaking, his expression tightening, then settling, then changing again. As the information came through, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Understood," he said, and ended the call. And for a moment, he did not move, did not speak. Just stood there processing the shift that had now fully reached him, because whatever had been initiated was no longer contained. It had reached command, it had reached decision-makers, it had reached the level where outcomes are determined, not debated. And when he turned back toward the cabin, toward Nicole, toward Brian, toward Darius, everything about his posture had changed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but fundamentally, like a man who had just realized he was no longer managing a situation. He was inside one. "We are not proceeding until this is cleared," he said, and this time, no one questioned it. Not because they fully understood, but because they could feel it, the weight of something larger than all of them pressing into the room, reshaping it, redefining it. And in the center of that shift, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been from the start, seated, composed, silent, but no longer overlooked, because now, every eye in that cabin saw him not as a problem to be removed, but as the reason everything had stopped. And as the realization settled deeper into the space, one thought began to form, quietly but clearly, in the minds of everyone watching. This situation had not escalated out of control. It had escalated into control, just not the kind they expected. The cabin did not erupt. It recalibrated, quieter but sharper, like every person on board had instinctively stepped back from the moment without physically moving. Because now it was clear that whatever was unfolding was no longer about procedure, it was about consequence, and consequences at this level did not announce themselves loudly. They revealed themselves in layers, one controlled shift at a time. Nicole lowered her tablet slightly, not out of surrender, but out of uncertainty, her earlier certainty now replaced by calculation. As if she were trying to piece together how a situation she had managed confidently minutes ago had transformed into something she could not fully interpret. Brian stood beside her, no longer speaking, no longer asserting, just watching the screen as new lines of information populated in real time, each update pulling further away from the narrative they had built. And across the aisle, the passengers who had once leaned forward out of curiosity now leaned back out of awareness. Because curiosity belongs to situations you can understand, but this was no longer that. This was something unfolding beyond their reach, something structured, something deliberate, and in the center of it, Darius Cole remained exactly as he had been, composed, grounded, not reacting to the shift because he had already accounted for it. His calm no longer misread as passivity, but recognized as control, and that recognition changed everything. Because once people see control where they expected uncertainty, they begin to question every assumption that led them there. Captain, Nicole said again, her voice lower now, more measured. We need clarification. And that word, clarification, marked a turning point, because it acknowledged what she had not been willing to admit before, that the situation was no longer clear, that the authority she had relied on was no longer sufficient. And Daniel looked at her, then at Darius, then back at his device, as if triangulating between what he saw, what he was told, and what he was beginning to understand. It is already being reviewed, he said, and that sentence carried weight. Because review at that level does not wait, it acts. And while the cabin processed that, something else happened, subtle but undeniable. The gate agent's voice came through the overhead speaker, slightly distorted, slightly delayed. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a brief hold. Please remain seated. And the phrasing was careful, neutral, but the timing was not coincidental, because holds do not happen without cause. And now the cause was inside the aircraft, visible to everyone, even if not fully understood. And a ripple moved through the passengers. Not panic, not frustration, but awareness, because delays tied to internal matters rarely resolve quietly. They expand, they escalate, they reach beyond the immediate environment. And the woman recording lowered her phone just slightly, not stopping, just adjusting. As if she realized she was no longer capturing an incident, she was documenting a shift, and 2 rows back. The man who had been watching quietly finally spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry. They picked the wrong person, and no one disagreed. Not openly, not anymore, because disagreement requires certainty, and certainty had left the room. Brian's tablet buzzed again, and this time he did not hesitate. He turned it toward Nicole without a word, and as she read, her expression changed again. Not confusion this time, not even uncertainty, but recognition, the kind that comes when scattered pieces suddenly align into something undeniable. This is linked to executive oversight, she said quietly, and that phrase settled into the cabin like a final confirmation, because executive oversight does not engage for minor disputes. It engages when stakes are high, when implications extend beyond individuals, when decisions made in one space affect systems far beyond it. And suddenly, the idea that this was just about a seat felt almost absurd, almost naive. And Daniel's device chimed once more, another call, and when he answered, his posture straightened, not out of authority, but out of awareness, because now he understood who he was speaking to, and who that call was about. "Yes, he is here," he said, and that one sentence shifted the room again, because it confirmed something no one had said out loud yet, that Darius was not just involved in the situation, he was central to it, essential to it, and whatever decision was being made on the other end of that call revolved around him, not around the crew, not around the flight, not around the schedule. And as Daniel listened, nodding slightly, his expression settled into something new, something that combined professionalism with caution, like a man navigating a line he had not expected to walk. And when the call ended, he did not address the crew first, he addressed Darius, turning fully toward him, his tone respectful, deliberate. "Sir, we are awaiting confirmation from corporate before proceeding." And that was it, the full reversal, subtle but complete, because now the flow of authority had changed direction, no longer pushing toward Darius, but orienting around him. And Nicole felt it. Brian felt it. The passengers felt it. Even the couple near the aisle felt it, shifting slightly as if to create distance from a moment they had unknowingly stepped into. And Darius acknowledged the statement with a small nod. Nothing more, because more was not necessary. The system was already speaking on his behalf, and as the seconds stretched, not uncomfortably, but deliberately, like a countdown no one could see, but everyone could feel, one thing became undeniable. This was not a disruption being managed, it was a decision being made, and when that decision arrived, it would not just resolve the moment, it would redefine it. The wait did not feel like waiting anymore. It felt like pressure building, slow and controlled, the kind that does not explode but compresses everything around it until something has to give. And in that cabin, every person could feel it now, not as tension, but as awareness, because the situation had crossed a line no one could redraw. And the silence that followed Daniel's last statement was not empty. It was full of recalculation, full of reconsideration, full of quiet realization that whatever decision was coming would not just resolve a misunderstanding, it would expose one. And Nicole stood there, no longer directing, no longer asserting, just present in a moment that had outgrown her authority, her eyes moving from Darius to Daniel too. The tablet in her hand, as if searching for something that would restore the balance she had lost. But balance, once shifted at this level, does not return easily. It transforms, and Brian, still beside her, had stopped trying to interpret the data altogether, because it was no longer data he could manage, it was information meant for people above his level, and that realization settled into his posture, into the way he held the tablet slightly lower now, no longer as a tool of certainty, but as evidence of something he did not fully control. And across the aisle, the passengers had grown quieter, not out of boredom, but out of recognition, because they were no longer watching an argument. They were witnessing a correction, one that was unfolding without raised voices, without visible force, but with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. And Darius Cole remained the still point in all of it. His presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, just acknowledged, even if not fully understood, because understanding takes time, and this moment was moving faster than that. "Sir," Daniel said again, his tone careful, measured, carrying the weight of someone who knew he was no longer speaking from the top of the chain, but somewhere within it. "We are receiving direct instructions." And that phrase landed with a clarity that cut through the room. Because direct instructions do not leave room for interpretation, they define the next step, and for the first time since this began, Nicole did not respond immediately. She did not correct, did not redirect. She simply listened, and that silence from her carried more meaning than any statement she could have made, because it confirmed what everyone was beginning to feel, that control had moved, not disappeared, not dissolved, but relocated, and it was no longer in the hands of those who had first asserted it. And then it happened, not with a shout, not with an announcement, but with a single, quiet update that appeared on Brian's tablet. And this time, he did not try to process it alone. He turned the screen outward, instinctively, as if the information itself demanded to be seen. And Nicole leaned in, her eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping, and the shift in her expression was immediate, not confusion, not hesitation, but realization, the kind that arrives fully formed and leaves no room for denial. "This is a priority override," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but in that cabin, it echoed, because priority override does not just adjust a situation, it replaces it. It redefines who has authority and who does not. And suddenly, everything that had been said earlier, every assumption, every instruction, every command, felt like it belonged to a different moment, a different reality, one that no longer applied. And Daniel's device chimed again, not with urgency this time, but with finality. And when he looked at it, he did not hesitate, did not question, he simply nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew was coming. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that carried through every row of that cabin. "We have received confirmation," he said, and the room seemed to hold its breath, not because they knew what he was about to say, but because they understood it would change everything. And he turned slightly, not toward Nicole, not toward Brian, but toward Darius, aligning himself with the direction of authority rather than the position he had held before. "This passenger is fully verified and cleared at the highest level." And that sentence did more than resolve the situation, it inverted it, because now the question was no longer whether Darius belonged there. It was why he had ever been questioned at all. And the weight of that inversion settled into every corner of the cabin, into the posture of the crew, into the expressions of the passengers, into the silence that followed. Because silence, in moments like this, is not absence, it is acknowledgement. And Nicole lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because she understood now, not just what had happened, but what it meant, that the decision she had made, the assumption she had acted on, had collided with something far larger than she had anticipated. And Brian stepped back fully this time, creating space not out of instruction, but out of instinct, because the center of the situation had shifted completely, and that center was no longer contested, it was established. And Darius, still seated, still composed, looked at Daniel for a brief moment, then at Nicole, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm that carried its own message, one that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as the cabin absorbed that moment, as the realization settled fully into place, one truth became undeniable. This was not a correction being made quietly behind the scenes. It was a real-time recalibration of power, visible to everyone, undeniable to anyone paying attention, and it was not finished yet. The weight did not feel like waiting anymore. It felt like pressure building, slow and controlled, the kind that does not explode but compresses everything around it until something has to give. And in that cabin, every person could feel it now, not as tension, but as awareness, because the situation had crossed a line no one could redraw. And the silence that followed Daniel's last statement was not empty. It was full of recalculation, full of reconsideration, full of quiet realization that whatever decision was coming would not just resolve a misunderstanding, it would expose one. And Nicole stood there, no longer directing, no longer asserting, just present in a moment that had outgrown her authority, her eyes moving from Darius to Daniel to the tablet in her hand, as if searching for something that would restore the balance she had lost. But balance, once shifted at this level, does not return easily. It transforms, and Brian, still beside her, had stopped trying to interpret the data altogether, because it was no longer data he could manage, it was information meant for people above his level. And that realization settled into his posture, into the way he held the tablet slightly lower now, no longer as a tool of certainty, but as evidence of something he did not fully control. And across the aisle, the passengers had grown quieter, not out of boredom, but out of recognition, because they were no longer watching an argument, they were witnessing a correction, one that was unfolding without raised voices, without visible force, but with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. And Darius Cole remained the still point in all of it. His presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, just acknowledged, even if not fully understood, because understanding takes time, and this moment was moving faster than that. "Sir," Daniel said again, his tone careful, measured, carrying the weight of someone who knew he was no longer speaking from the top of the chain, but somewhere within it. "We are receiving direct instructions." And that phrase landed with a clarity that cut through the room, because direct instructions do not leave room for interpretation. They define the next step. And for the first time since this began, Nicole did not respond immediately. She did not correct, did not redirect. She simply listened, and that silence from her carried more meaning than any statement she could have made, because it confirmed what everyone was beginning to feel. That control had moved, not disappeared, not dissolved, but relocated, and it was no longer in the hands of those who had first asserted it. And then it happened, not with a shout, not with an announcement, but with a single, quiet update that appeared on Brian's tablet. And this time, he did not try to process it alone. He turned the screen outward, instinctively, as if the information itself demanded to be seen, and Nicole leaned in, her eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping, and the shift in her expression was immediate, not confusion, not hesitation, but realization, the kind that arrives fully formed and leaves no room for denial. "This is a priority override," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but in that cabin, it echoed, because priority override does not just adjust a situation, it replaces it. It redefines who has authority and who does not. And suddenly, everything that had been said earlier, every assumption, every instruction, every command, felt like it belonged to a different moment, a different reality, one that no longer applied. And Daniel's device chimed again, not with urgency this time, but with finality. And when he looked at it, he did not hesitate, did not question. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew was coming. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that carried through every row of that cabin. "We have received confirmation," he said, and the room seemed to hold its breath, not because they knew what he was about to say, but because they understood it would change everything. And he turned slightly, not toward Nicole, not toward Brian, but toward Darius, aligning himself with the direction of authority rather than the position he had held before. "This passenger is fully verified and cleared at the highest level." And that sentence did more than resolve the situation. It inverted it, because now the question was no longer whether Darius belonged there. It was why he had ever been questioned at all, and the weight of that inversion settled into every corner of the cabin, into the posture of the crew, into the expressions of the passengers, into the silence that followed, because silence, in moments like this, is not absence, it is acknowledgement. And Nicole lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because she understood now, not just what had happened, but what it meant, that the decision she had made, the assumption she had acted on, had collided with something far larger than she had anticipated. And Brian stepped back fully this time, creating space not out of instruction, but out of instinct, because the center of the situation had shifted completely, and that center was no longer contested, it was established. And Darius, still seated, still composed, looked at Daniel for a brief moment, then at Nicole, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm that carried its own message, one that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as the cabin absorbed that moment, as the realization settled fully into place, one truth became undeniable. This was not a correction being made quietly behind the scenes. It was a real-time recalibration of power, visible to everyone, undeniable to anyone paying attention, and it was not finished yet. For a moment, nothing moved forward, not the crew, not the passengers, not even the quiet hum of expectation that had filled the cabin before all of this began, because now everything was suspended in a different kind of tension, one that did not come from conflict but from consequence. And Darius Cole sat in the center of it, not elevated, not announced, but undeniably positioned as the point around which everything else now revolved. And in that stillness, something shifted inside him. Not visible, not spoken, but real, because moments like this do not begin where they happen. They begin long before, in smaller rooms, in quieter dismissals, in looks that linger just a second too long, in questions that are not really questions. And for Darius, those moments had never left, they had just evolved, sharpened, refined into something he carried without showing. And for a brief second, his gaze drifted, not away from the present, but through it, as if another time was layered beneath this one, a memory not loud enough to interrupt but strong enough to inform. A younger version of himself standing at the edge of a different room, holding a folder filled with projections no one had asked to see, being told without being told that he did not fit, that his presence was unexpected, that his confidence was misplaced. and he had stood there then the same way he sat now, still, composed, absorbing more than reacting, because reaction had never been his strategy. Understanding had, and understanding had taught him something simple but powerful, that spaces do not reject you by accident. They reveal themselves through how they respond when you arrive. And now, back in the present, that lesson was unfolding again, just on a different scale, at a different altitude. And the difference this time was not how he was being treated, it was what he was prepared to do about it. "Sir," Daniel said again, his voice careful, respectful, but now carrying something else, something closer to accountability. "Corporate has requested a direct line with you." And that sentence landed with a quiet gravity, because it confirmed what had already been implied, that whatever authority had been activated was not only aware of the situation, it was now engaging with it directly, and that engagement did not flow through the crew, it flowed through Darius. And Nicole heard it, Brian heard it, every passenger within range heard it, and the meaning was clear. The center of decision had shifted completely, and now the system itself was reaching out, not to manage the situation, but to respond to him. And Darius looked at Daniel for a moment, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the next step in a process he had already set in motion, and he nodded once. "Put it through," he said, and even that was calm, controlled, like a man answering a call he had expected all along. And Daniel stepped aside slightly, handing over the secure line, his posture reflecting a level of deference that had not existed minutes ago, because now he understood exactly where he stood in relation to the man in front of him. And as Darius took the device, the cabin leaned in again, not physically, but in focus, because this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, even, not raised, not rushed. "This is Cole," he said, and that name, spoken without explanation, without title, carried its own weight, because names at that level do not need introduction. They carry recognition with them, and whatever was said on the other end was not heard by the cabin, but it did not need to be, because the response was enough. "No," Darius said calmly. "You do not fix this later. You address it now." And that sentence drew a line, clear and immediate, because it rejected delay, rejected deflection, demanded presence in the moment where the issue had occurred, and that demand resonated beyond the call, into the space around him, into the awareness of everyone listening, because it confirmed something they were already beginning to understand, that this was not about inconvenience, it was about accountability, and accountability does not wait for landing. It happens where the decision was made. "I am still on the aircraft," he continued, his tone unchanged, "and so is your problem." And that phrasing landed sharply, not aggressive, not confrontational, but precise, because it framed the situation exactly as it was, not as an isolated incident, but as a reflection of something larger, something systemic, something that could not be resolved quietly once the moment passed. And there was a pause, brief but noticeable, as the person on the other end processed that. And then Darius listened, his expression unchanged, but his focus absolute, because now the conversation had reached the level where outcomes are defined, not suggested. And when he spoke again, it was slower, more deliberate, each word placed with intention. "Then start with the people involved," he said, and that was not a suggestion, it was direction, and everyone in that cabin felt it. The shift from reaction to resolution, from acknowledgement to action. And as he handed the device back to Daniel, the atmosphere in the room changed once more, not dramatically, not suddenly, but decisively, because now the next phase had begun, and this phase was not about verifying what had happened, it was about responding to it in a way that matched the level of authority now present. And as Daniel took the device, nodding slightly, understanding more than he said, one thing became unmistakably clear. This moment was no longer unfolding. It was being directed, and the direction did not belong to the crew. It belonged to the man they had just tried to remove. The moment the call ended, the silence did not return the same way it had before. It came back sharper, more defined, like every second now had weight, like every movement would mean something. And in that space, no one rushed to speak, because whatever had just been set in motion was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. And Daniel stood there holding the device a second longer than necessary before lowering it. his posture no longer that of a man managing a situation, but of someone standing inside a decision that had already been made. And Nicole felt it immediately, the shift from waiting to outcome, from possibility to consequence, and her eyes moved again to Darius, not searching this time, not questioning, just recognizing, because recognition is what remains when assumption collapses, and Brian, who had spent the last several minutes reacting to updates he did not understand, now stopped entirely, his tablet still in his hand, but no longer active in his grip, as if even the system he relied on had stepped beyond him. And across the aisle, the passengers leaned in once more, but not out of curiosity, not out of confusion. This time it was anticipation, because something was about to happen, something that would define everything they had just witnessed, and it did not come from the crew. It came from the system again, quiet, precise, undeniable. Brian's tablet lit up first, a new alert, different from the others, not informational, not advisory, but directive, and he did not speak, did not react immediately. He simply turned the screen toward Nicole, and that gesture alone was enough to shift the air again, because it meant whatever was there was not his to interpret, it was hers to face, and Nicole looked, and in that instant, her expression changed completely, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, like the last piece of a pattern had finally locked into place, and she exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just a controlled release of breath that carried understanding with it. "It is a compliance directive," she said quietly, and the words landed with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Because compliance at that level does not ask, it enforces, it aligns, it corrects, and suddenly, the idea that this moment could be handled internally, quietly, without consequence, disappeared entirely, because this was no longer internal. This had been elevated, documented, recorded, and now it was being acted upon. Daniel's device followed a second later, another alert, and when he read it, he did not hesitate, did not question, he simply nodded once, confirming what Nicole had already understood, and then he spoke, not to the crew, not to the cabin, but to Darius, aligning himself fully with the direction that had now been established. "Sir, corporate has initiated a formal response," he said, and that sentence carried more weight than anything else so far, because it confirmed that this was no longer about correcting a moment. It was about addressing a breach, and breaches at this level do not end with apologies, they end with action, and the cabin felt it, the shift from tension to inevitability, from uncertainty to outcome, and Nicole straightened slightly, not in defense, not in resistance, but in acceptance, because she understood now that whatever came next was not hers to control, it was hers to face, and she turned to Darius again, her voice measured, deliberate. "Sir, we acknowledge that this situation was mishandled," she said, and that acknowledgement, simple as it was, carried a significance that went beyond the words themselves, because it was the first time the reality of what had happened had been stated plainly, without deflection, without qualification, and Darius listened, his expression unchanged, not because the words did not matter, but because he understood what they represented, a step, not a solution, and steps like that only matter if they lead somewhere. "Continue," he said calmly, and that single word shifted the dynamic again, because it made it clear that acknowledgement alone was not enough, that resolution required more than recognition. It required action, and Nicole nodded once, absorbing that, adjusting to it. "A full review is being logged," she continued, "including all interactions leading up to this moment." And that sentence extended the scope of the situation beyond the visible, beyond the cabin, into the system itself, into records, into accountability that would not disappear once the flight resumed. And Brian stepped back slightly, not instructed, not directed, but instinctively, because he understood that his role in this moment had already been defined by what had been recorded, and across the aisle, the woman recording lifted her phone again, capturing not the conflict now, but the response, because that was where the truth of the situation lived, not in what was said at the start, but in how it was handled at the end. And Daniel added, his voice steady, aligned, "Further actions will be determined by executive review." And that phrase carried its own gravity, because executive review does not operate on impressions, it operates on facts, on records, on decisions that have already been made. And as those words settled into the cabin, The final layer of the moment revealed itself. This was not just a correction. It was a turning point, a moment where authority had been tested and found incomplete, and now it was being redefined in real time. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, not raised, not elevated, but now fully recognized. And as the weight of that recognition settled into every person on that plane, one truth stood clear above all others. This situation had not ended. It had transformed, and what came next would not be decided by those who had started it, but by the one they had underestimated. The acknowledgement settled, but it did not conclude anything. It opened something, a space where the next move mattered more than anything said so far. And in that space, all eyes returned to Darius Cole, not because anyone instructed them to, but because instinct had already adjusted to the new center of gravity in the room, and Darius did not rush to fill that space. He let it exist. Let the silence stretch just enough for everyone to feel the weight of what had already been established. Because power, real power, does not compete with noise, it lets the room come to it, and when he finally moved, it was subtle, a shift. Forward in his seat, a slight adjustment of his posture, but the effect was immediate. The entire cabin leaned in again, not physically, but mentally, because they understood that whatever came next would define everything that had happened before. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but unmistakably firm. "You logged it," he said, looking directly at Nicole, and she nodded, once. Because there was no reason to deny it. No space left for deflection. "Good," he continued, and that single word carried a weight that did not match its simplicity, because it signaled that acknowledgement alone was not the end. It was the beginning of accountability, and he turned his gaze slightly, not away from her, but across the space, including Brian, including Daniel, including every person who had played a role in the moment. And when he spoke again, it was not louder, but it reached further. "Now understand what you logged," he said, and that sentence reframed everything, because it shifted the focus from action to meaning, from what happened to what it represented, and that distinction mattered, because systems do not respond to isolated incidents. They respond to patterns, to implications, to what those incidents reveal about how decisions are made. And Nicole held his gaze, listening, not interrupting, not correcting, because she understood now that this was no longer a conversation about process. It was a confrontation with consequence. "You did not question a ticket," Darius continued, his tone steady, each word placed with intention. "You questioned a presence." And that line settled into the room like a truth that had been waiting to be said, because everyone there had felt it, even if they had not named it, the difference between verifying information and judging identity. And now that difference was clear, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Brian shifted slightly, his eyes dropping for a moment before returning, because recognition is uncomfortable when it arrives all at once. And Daniel remained still, absorbing the words not as an accusation, but as a correction, because that was what it was, a precise realignment of what the situation actually was versus what it had been assumed to be. And Darius continued, not rushing, not escalating, just unfolding the logic of the moment in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. "You had the system," he said, glancing briefly at the tablet, "but you chose perception. And that was the core of it, the decision point, the moment where information was available but not used, where assumption replaced verification, and that choice, more than anything else, defined what had happened." And as those words settled, the cabin did not react with noise. It reacted with stillness, because stillness is what follows when something true is recognized collectively. And the woman recording lowered her phone slightly again, not because the moment had lost importance, but because it had gained clarity, and clarity does not need amplification. It speaks for itself. And Nicole inhaled slowly, her posture steady, but her expression now fully aligned with the reality in front of her. "You are right," she said, and those 3 words carried more weight than any explanation could have, because they acknowledged not just the outcome, but the reasoning behind it. And that acknowledgement shifted the tone of the moment again, from defense to acceptance, from resistance to responsibility. And Darius nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition, because acknowledgement is necessary, but it is not sufficient, and he made that clear with what came next. "So here is what happens," he said. And that phrase drew a line forward, from past to future, from what had occurred to what would follow. And every person in that cabin felt it, the transition from analysis to action. You do not wait until landing, he continued, his voice steady, unwavering. You address it where it happened, and that directive landed with precision, because it removed the option of delay, of deferral, of quiet resolution after the fact. And in doing so, it forced the response into the same space where the decision had been made, and Daniel nodded slightly, understanding the implication immediately, because operationally, that meant escalation now, not later, accountability now, not after review. And Nicole absorbed it as well, her stance adjusting again, aligning with the direction being set, because she understood that this was no longer about preserving the flow of the flight. It was about correcting the integrity of the process, and Darius leaned back slightly then, not disengaging, but signaling that the directive had been given, that the next move was not his to make, but theirs to execute. And that shift, subtle as it was, completed the inversion of the entire situation. Because now the responsibility sat fully with the crew, not to manage him, but to respond to what had been revealed. And around them, the cabin remained quiet, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because everyone understood that what they had just witnessed was not a confrontation. It was a recalibration, a moment where power had been clarified, where assumptions had been exposed, and where the outcome was no longer in question, only the response was. And as that realization settled deeper into the space, one thing became undeniable. This was not just about correcting a mistake, it was about setting a standard, and that standard had just been defined in real time by the one person they had failed to recognize when it mattered most. The directive had been given, and unlike everything that came before it, this moment did not invite hesitation. It demanded response, immediate and visible, and the difference showed instantly in how the crew moved. Not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate, as if every action now carried a weight they had not considered before. Daniel stepped forward first, not to reclaim authority, but to execute it properly this time. His posture aligned with the shift that had already taken place. Nicole, he said, his tone firm but controlled, begin formal incident documentation at the operational level. And that instruction was not casual. It was procedural, structured, irreversible. Because once documentation begins at that level, it does not disappear. It becomes part of the system, part of the record, part of the accountability that follows. And Nicole nodded immediately, not out of habit, but out of understanding, because she knew what that meant, not just for the moment, but for what came after. And she moved, tapping into her device with a precision that had been missing earlier, each entry now careful, accurate, reflective of what had actually occurred rather than what had been assumed. And Brian, standing beside her, adjusted as well, no longer reacting, no longer interpreting, but supporting the process as it unfolded, because now there was no ambiguity about what needed to be done. And across the aisle, the passengers watched the shift with a different kind of attention, not curiosity, not judgment, but recognition, because they were witnessing something rare, not just a correction, but a real-time acknowledgement of failure and the immediate steps to address it. And that kind of moment does not happen often, not in spaces like this, not in systems designed to move forward without looking back. And yet here it was, unfolding in front of them, clear and undeniable. We are also notifying ground operations, Daniel continued, his voice steady, and initiating internal review protocols before departure. And that sentence extended the scope even further, because it meant the response was no longer contained within the aircraft. It was expanding outward, into the broader system, into departments that would not see this as an isolated incident, but as a signal, something that required examination, adjustment, and possibly correction beyond this single moment. And Nicole's hands moved quickly but carefully, logging, timestamping, capturing details that could not be rewritten later. And as she worked, her expression remained focused, not defensive, not reactive, but aligned with the responsibility she now carried. And Darius watched it all, not directing, not interrupting, because the direction had already been given. And what followed now was execution, and execution, when done properly, does not need constant oversight. It needs clarity, and that clarity had been established. And for a moment, the cabin felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, but structured, like the pieces that had been out of place were now being put back in alignment, one by one. And the couple who had once hovered near his seat remained still, their earlier presence now quiet, almost withdrawn, as if they understood that the moment had moved far beyond them, that they were no longer part of the equation, and the woman recording lowered her phone completely this time, not because the moment had ended, but because it had reached a point where observation alone was enough, because what was happening now was not spectacle, it was process, and process at this level speaks for itself. And then Daniel turned again, not to the crew, but to Darius, his posture respectful, his tone aligned with the reality that had been established. "Sir, we are implementing the corrective steps as directed," he said, and that statement, simple as it was, carried a weight of acknowledgement, because it confirmed that the direction had been received, understood, and was now being acted upon without resistance, and Darius nodded once, not as approval, but as recognition, because what mattered was not the words, it was the action. And the action was happening, in real time, in front of everyone, and that visibility mattered, because it transformed the moment from something that could be dismissed into something that had to be accounted for. And Nicole paused briefly, looking up from her device, her gaze meeting Darius's again, and this time there was no assumption in it, no uncertainty, just clarity, and she spoke, her voice steady. "The record will reflect exactly what occurred," she said, and that sentence, more than any apology could have been, carried a commitment, because records, once entered, define how a system learns, how it adjusts, how it prevents repetition, and Darius held her gaze for a second, then nodded slightly, because that was the point, not just acknowledgement, not just correction, but documentation that ensures the moment does not disappear once it is no longer visible. And as the final entries were logged, as the systems updated, as the process moved from initiation to completion, the cabin settled into a new kind of quiet, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of resolution, because what had needed to be addressed was being addressed, not perfectly, not instantly, but properly, and that distinction mattered. And as the last notification confirmed that the documentation had been submitted and the internal review had been triggered, one truth became clear to everyone present. This was no longer a situation that had been mishandled. It was a situation that had been confronted, corrected, and recorded, and that difference would not fade. When the plane finally moved, it would follow, through systems, through processes, through decisions made long after this moment ended. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been from the start, not elevated by the moment, but revealed by it. And in that revelation, everything else had been forced to adjust. By the time the final confirmation came through, the cabin no longer felt like a place in transit. It felt like a place that had paused long enough to correct itself. And that distinction mattered, because movement without correction only carries problems forward. But this moment had stopped, examined, and now it was responding in a way that would not be erased by altitude or time. Daniel's device chimed once more, but this time the tone was different, not urgent, not escalating, but conclusive. And when he read it, he did not need to interpret, he did not need to question, because the message was clear, structured, and final in its direction. And when he lifted his head, the entire cabin seemed to register it before he even spoke, because there is a certain stillness that precedes resolution, a quiet understanding that what comes next will not be debated, it will be delivered. "We have received final instructions from corporate," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the rows without force. And every eye turned again, not out of tension, but out of awareness. Because this was the point where everything aligned, where the internal system and the visible moment would meet, and Nicole stood beside him, no longer uncertain, no longer recalibrating, but prepared, because she understood now that this was not about managing perception, it was about executing accountability, and Brian, just behind her, held his position without movement, as if recognizing that his role now was simply to witness what followed. And Daniel continued, each word deliberate. "Effective immediately, this incident has been escalated to executive compliance review with full documentation attached." And that sentence carried weight beyond the cabin, because executive compliance does not operate within moments. It operates across systems, across patterns, across decisions that define how an organization functions, and suddenly, What had happened here was no longer confined to this flight. It was part of something larger, something that would be examined, questioned, and addressed at a level that does not ignore detail. And Nicole stepped forward slightly, her voice measured, aligned with the directive. All crew actions involved in this interaction are now under formal review, she said, and that clarity removed any remaining ambiguity, because formal review does not suggest possibility. It confirms scrutiny, and scrutiny at that level leads somewhere. It always does. And the cabin absorbed that, not with reaction, but with recognition, because everyone understood what that meant, not just for the individuals involved, but for the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. And then Daniel added, his tone unchanged but his words carrying a final layer of consequence. Pending review, operational privileges may be suspended or reassigned as determined by corporate. And that was it, the structural impact, the shift from acknowledgement to consequence. And no one in the cabin needed further explanation, because the meaning was clear. Actions have outcomes, and those outcomes do not disappear once they are documented. They follow, they adjust. They redefine how authority is exercised moving forward. And Nicole lowered her gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in understanding, because she knew now that this moment would not end when the plane took off. It would continue, through reports, through evaluations, through decisions made by people who were not present, but now fully informed. And Brian exhaled quietly, the first visible release of tension since the shift began, because the uncertainty had been replaced with clarity, and clarity, even when difficult, is easier to hold than confusion. And across the aisle, the passengers sat differently now, not leaning in, not observing, but processing, because what they had witnessed was no longer unfolding. It had concluded in a way that carried forward, and the woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely, her focus no longer on capturing the moment, but on understanding it. Because some moments are not meant to be replayed, they are meant to be remembered. And Darius Cole, still seated, still composed, listened to it all without interruption, because this was not new to him. Not the structure, not the response, not the way systems move when they are forced to confront something they overlooked. And when Daniel finished speaking, the cabin remained quiet, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said had been. And Darius leaned forward slightly, just enough to re-enter the center of the moment. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying the same controlled weight it had from the beginning. That is the process, he said, and those words were not dismissive, not critical, but precise, because they acknowledged what had been initiated without overstating it. And then he paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle, before continuing, now understand the impact. And that sentence extended the moment beyond procedure, beyond documentation, into something deeper, something that could not be logged as easily. Because impact is not just what happens on paper, it is what happens in perception, in trust, in the invisible space between people and the systems they rely on. And he looked at Nicole, then at Brian, then at Daniel, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity. You did not just log an incident, he said, you exposed a pattern, and that line carried more weight than anything before it, because it reframed the entire situation, not as a single error, but as part of something larger, something that required more than correction. It required change, and no one responded immediately, not because they disagreed, but because they understood, and understanding at that level does not come with quick answers. It comes with silence, reflection, and the beginning of accountability that extends beyond the moment itself. And as that silence settled one final time, not heavy, not tense, but resolved, the cabin shifted back into motion, not physically yet, but mentally, because the moment had reached its conclusion, and that conclusion did not erase what had happened, it defined it, and in defining it, it ensured that it would not simply pass, it would remain, recorded, reviewed, and most importantly, remembered. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole sat exactly where he had been from the start, not changed by the moment, but having changed it, and in that distinction, everything else had been forced to adjust. The cabin did not erupt into applause. It did not need to, because what had just happened was not performance. It was proof, and proof does not require noise to be understood. It settles, it anchors, it stays long after the moment itself has passed. And as the final layer of silence eased into something calmer, something more grounded, the aircraft slowly began to return to its intended purpose, but it did not feel the same, because everyone inside it had changed their position, not physically, but mentally, and that shift would not disappear with altitude. Daniel stepped back into his role, but it was not the same role he had held before. It was informed now, shaped by what had just unfolded, and when he spoke again, it was not to correct, not to command, but to restore. "We will be resuming standard departure procedures shortly," he said, his tone steady, professional, but carrying a quiet awareness that had not been there at the beginning. And Nicole stood beside him, composed, her posture aligned not with authority alone, but with accountability, her earlier certainty replaced with something more grounded, more precise. And Brian remained still, no longer searching for answers in a screen, because the answer had already been given, not through data, but through consequence. And across the aisle, the passengers settled back into their seats, but they did not return to what they had been before, because once you witness a moment where perception is corrected by truth, you do not forget it, you carry it, you measure future moments against it. And the woman who had been recording looked at her phone one last time before lowering it completely, not because the moment had ended, but because it had reached a point where it no longer needed to be captured. It had already made its mark, and 2 rows back. The man who had spoken earlier leaned back slowly, shaking his head once more, but this time there was something different in it, not recognition alone, but respect, because he had seen how the moment was handled, not with volume, not with force, but with control, and control at that level is not common. And in the center of it all, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been, not elevated by what had happened, not changed by it, but defined through it. And that definition did not come from what he said. It came from how he moved through the moment, how he chose not to react when reaction would have been easy, how he allowed the system to reveal itself rather than forcing it to respond. And that choice, more than anything else, was what reshaped the entire situation, because it exposed not just a mistake, but a mindset, not just an incident, but a pattern. And as the cabin transitioned fully back into motion, as overhead bins were checked, as final announcements were prepared, as the subtle rhythm of departure returned, something else remained, something quieter but far more significant, a recalibrated understanding of what authority looks like when it is tested, and what happens when it is forced to answer for itself. Daniel moved down the aisle briefly, not out of necessity, but out of intention, pausing near Darius just long enough to meet his gaze, not to speak, not to explain, just to acknowledge, because some moments do not require words. They require recognition, and that recognition was given, clear and unspoken, and Nicole followed that example in her own way, not approaching, not interrupting, but carrying forward the responsibility of what had been set in motion, because she understood now that the moment did not end here. It continued, through reports, through review, through the changes that would follow, and Brian, standing just behind, remained quiet, absorbing the weight of it all, because for him, this was not just a shift in procedure, it was a shift in perspective, one that would not be easily forgotten. And as the final clearance came through, as the aircraft prepared to push back from the gate, the cabin settled into a steady calm, not the same calm it had at the beginning, but a different one built on awareness rather than assumption. And Darius leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. But there was a finality to the moment now, not because something had ended, but because something had been established. And when he spoke one last time, it was not loud, not directed at anyone in particular, but it carried, clear and precise. "You did not need to know who I was," he said, his voice even, controlled. "You needed to know how to treat who you thought I was." And that line settled into the cabin like a closing statement, not dramatic, not forced, but complete, because it captured everything that had happened in a way no report ever could. It reduced the moment to its essence, its truth, its lesson, and no one responded, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing left to add. And as the aircraft finally began to move, slowly pulling away from the gate, carrying everyone forward into whatever came next, one thing remained certain. This was not just a moment that had passed. It was a moment that would stay, in memory, in record, in the quiet understanding, that sometimes The most powerful response is not the one that raises its voice, but the one that reveals the truth and lets everything else adjust around it.